Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. I'm Ian McCollum, and I want to talk for a minute about the reality of the firearms industry. So I'm sitting here recording on an iPhone in a hotel room because I am actually on a trip right now doing some photography for the next Vickers Guide book. But we have seen some news come out today, or yesterday perhaps by the time you see this, that Hudson Manufacturing has formally declared bankruptcy. And I think it's worth taking a minute to talk about the reality of the firearms industry and how this applies. So, in fact, when you look at it, some of the guns that I've been particularly excited about in recent years haven't done all that well, and that could be fairly disconcerting. But to be honest, this doesn't come to me as a huge shocking surprise. And I think that's because I look at a lot of historical firearms companies, and if you watch all the videos that I do, you'll have seen them too, although maybe it hasn't really sunk in. The reality of the fact is most firearms companies go bankrupt. Most of the new guns that are put out, whether today or 50 years ago or 150 years ago, most of them don't actually work out. We can look at some of the most iconic, ultimately most successful firearms manufacturers in American or even in world history and see that they've all, if they haven't gone bankrupt, they've come close. Samuel Colt invents the revolver, one of perhaps the most fundamentally revolutionary concepts in firearms technology, and proceeds to go bankrupt on his very first gun. The Colt Patterson revolver went bankrupt. It was only a couple of years later, with basically one really outstanding fanboy client in Walker, who commissioned the Walker revolvers, that allowed Colt to form a new company and actually make enough money to form a serious long-term manufacturing concern. The Patterson company just died. Patterson revolvers, while ahead of their time and this great technology, they didn't sell. People didn't want them, people didn't buy them, and the company went out of business in an ignominious failure. So if the guns that I've been excited about recently of particular note include the Hudson H9 and the HMG Sturmgewehrs. And as you guys obviously have seen, neither of those has gone all that well. Now, the Hudson went better, and what's interesting is, let me back up a step. The firearms industry, especially in the United States today, is a very precarious one in that it's not that guns won't sell. Guns, in fact, sell very well in the United States on the civilian market. And of course, there's always a market for military firearms across the world. Every nation has to have a military, and they're all going to buy guns for them. The problem is there are a lot of people making guns, and there are a lot of very good guns available on the market today. If you look at handguns, you almost have a hard time. If you have $500 or $600 in your pocket, you're going to have a difficult time making a bad decision on a handgun, unless you buy a Taurus Judge or something. But if you look at the major manufacturers, you've got Smith & Wesson making M&Ps, excellent guns. You've got Ruger making Ruger Americans. Those are good guns. You've got Glock. Shoot, for $500 or $600, you can get almost any Glock out there, and it's going to be a fantastic gun, as good as anything on the market. And there's no reason that, what more do you want? It's going to be super reliable. It's going to be accurate. It's going to be it's everything you would want. And you've got probably half a dozen really top tier manufacturers that are making guns like this. HK, Steyr, basically everyone out there on the market makes FN. Everyone out there makes a really good service type automatic pistol. And so for a company like Hudson to try and break into that market with what is, I continue to believe, a very good pistol. The problem is it's a very good pistol that's also a relatively expensive pistol. They were selling that thing for $1,100 or $1,200, which is about double the going rate for a standard generic, it'll shoot 9mm, it'll do it with boring reliability, it'll do it accurately. And you know what? You're going to be able to count at least 5 or 6 law enforcement or security agencies that are using the same gun that you are, almost regardless of which major manufacturer you buy. So how do you break into that market? You know what? It's difficult. And as best I can tell, I don't have any actual data on this, but the rumors that I've heard, and this makes intellectual sense to me, unfortunately, is that Hudson shot themselves in the foot with the H9A, the aluminum framed Hudson gun. They introduced that at SHOT Show in 2018, so a little over a year ago. And there were a lot of people, like, that was a fantastic gun. And I'm actually, in fact, I'm part of the problem here. I shot the H9A from Hudson. And at that point, we had gotten a tested, Carl and I, in-range TV, we'd gotten a T&E standard H9 Hudson pistol, steel frame, and we shot it and we really liked it. But there's two of us, there's me and there's Carl, and we had one gun and we both wanted one because we did, and we still do, really like that pistol design. So I was planning on buying myself a Hudson H9, and when I got to SHOT Show and I shot the H9A aluminum frame, I looked at that thing and I shot it and I realized this shoots like just as well. You know, the recoil, the system that Cy and Lauren Hudson came up with really does work. It's not just the weight of the gun, it's that mechanical system that they designed. It's great. And the aluminum frame H9A weighed something like 4 or 6 ounces less. It was substantially less, but it shot just as nicely. And so I figured, well, shoot, I'm not going to buy a steel one. These aluminum frame guns are coming out right around the corner. That was what they were advertising at SHOT Show. I'll wait and I'll get one of those. And a lot of people said that exact same thing, but they weren't able to actually release the aluminum frame guns. And I don't know why at this point. Hopefully someday we'll find out why, but they shot themselves in the foot. Like, they killed their future sales by announcing the new product without being able to immediately actually release the new product. And this is emblematic of how delicate the firearms industry really is. Like, you can be doing well, you can be selling guns, and one little mistake, like announcing that new product just too early, can cannibalize all your own sales, and all of a sudden there's no cash flow, which means you can't continue development of the aluminum frame gun or whatever your next improvement is. And then boom, like, no cash flow. How do you pay your employees? How do you pay the machine costs? Especially if you're producing guns, you owe taxes on those guns to the federal government. There's an 11% excise tax on firearms and ammunition. Some of you guys may not be aware of that, but like, more than the heaviest sales tax anywhere is owed by the manufacturer upon, in the case of a company like Hudson, if they're outsourcing any of their machining, when they receive and are invoiced for a wholesale price gun, they at that point owe federal excise tax on it. So if you produce 1,000 guns at $800 a piece, that's like an $80,000 bill. Do I have that right? I've drunk a little bit of wine. That's a significant tax bill that you owe right then for those guns before you've actually sold them. So there's a lot of financial liabilities that you're going to incur in this process. And that appears to have been the death knell and killed Hudson. One little mistake. You advertise that new gun just too early and boom, that's it. No more sales. No more sales mean no cash. No cash means your company goes bankrupt. So I don't know what the outcome will be with Hudson. I am in particular concerned for the people who had guns into Hudson for repair. And I know some people are going to be really pissed at Hudson that they bought new guns and they didn't work or they broke. Well, the reality of the matter is every firearm requires a substantial amount of testing and break-in before you can determine what are the problems and what are the manufacturing tweaks that you need to make. And this is a particular problem for new companies or small companies developing firearms. If you look at major military, like successful military firearms, look at really any of them, the AR-15, the FAL, the G3, the 1911, the Mauser bolt-action rifle, all of these guns, they take about 10 years to get right. It's 10 years of, we're going to make the first version, we're going to ship a bunch, people are going to get them, people are going to start using them, we're going to find out, like, we can't afford to, to make 50,000 guns and put 1,000 rounds through every one of them. Manufacturers can't afford to do that. They'll sell the first version to someone. That person, if they're a major military, will do that initial testing for them, whether they realize it or not. And then the company realizes, oh, okay, our extractor has this problem. We need to change this about the extractor. Maybe the gun has problems B, C, and D, and we'll fix those. And now we have the second version. Mauser is particularly easy to watch this process on. They start with the Mauser in 1889, and it's not until 1898 that they have the final tweaked version of this design that becomes really the world standard. The AR-15/M16 is kind of the same way. The early guns had problems. they develop, they iterate, they tweak, they improve the design, and now the AR-15 is really the best overall firearm that has ever been developed ever by anybody. And you'll see this with everybody else. The FAL, the G3, they all go through this process, and they all seem to take about 8 or 10 years to actually get right. So the fact that some of the very early Hudsons ended up having problems, that doesn't surprise me. And honestly, if you're the kind of person who's willing to purchase an early iteration of a gun, it shouldn't surprise you either. You should be ready and expect that to be a thing. Now, where the question comes is, how does Hudson respond to those problems? And as long as the company had cash flow, they seemed to be doing just fine. They were, taking in problems, recognizing what the root cause was, fixing those individual guns and sending them back to customers, and then, I hope, iterating their design to prevent those problems from coming up in future production. The problem is, when they run out of cash flow, they can no longer do that. And now, if you send a gun in, you're in this weird limbo of the company's gone bankrupt, they have your gun. I would like to say that I trust that Cy and Lauren Hudson will make sure that everyone who had a gun at Hudson for repair, even if it doesn't get fixed, it at least gets shipped back. It would be an absolute travesty if Hudson's bankruptcy involves like selling guns that had been returned to them for repair that were already purchased by customers. That would be unacceptable. Unfortunately, those people, well, hopefully something will develop in the future. I don't know, but cross your fingers. Hopefully something will develop. There will be some support, aftermarket support for existing Hudsons. But this is kind of part of the process of firearms design, and that's just how it works. The problem is firearms are a complicated mechanical device, and our standards for a firearm are really remarkably high. Again, this is one of those things that I don't think a lot of people really consider. Like, a firearm, by our standards, especially today, it has to be 100% reliable. Like, it can't have any sort of substantial malfunction over hundreds, if not thousands, of cycling iterations. For a mechanical device, that's huge. You look at your computer. If your computer freezes up every once in a while, or your cell phone freezes up every once in a while, you don't think about it. You just reboot it, no big deal. But we've gotten this attitude that a firearm has to be absolutely 100% reliable, and having one malfunction in 100 rounds is unacceptably poor reliability. That's a 1% error rate, and that's really not that bad by a lot of standards. You kind of have to get to like the aviation industry before you have the same like accepted standard of reliability as you have with the firearms industry. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying, think about what that requires from a manufacturing and an engineering standpoint to actually have a mass-produced product that costs, say, $500 to $1,000 that will run 1,000 iterations without a single malfunction. And that's including a wide variety of ammunition that people are going to put into it that the manufacturer doesn't have any control over. Again, I'm not trying to make an excuse for companies that can't do that. I'm saying we've set a pretty darn high bar, and we should understand how high that bar is. Now, another element of the firearms manufacturing industry today that I want to touch on is how difficult it is to meet that standard. And in this example, I'm going to touch on the HMG Sturmgewehrs. I think the problem with Sturmgewehrs is that Hale and Mack did not fundamentally understand just how different firearms manufacturing and standards are from like general engineering. So they had an engineering background. They worked in the engineering and manufacturing industry, but they had not worked in guns. And I think they underestimated how complicated it would be to manufacture a reliable and effective firearm. And I think we see some of that in their decision to tackle 4 separate calibers, all right at first, right at the beginning. They were going to offer those guns not in one single caliber with others added later after the first one came into production, but no, they were very confident that it would be no big deal to offer them in 223, 300 blackout, 7.62x39, and 8mm Kurz. And they're not the only people to fall victim to this. Like, look at the L85, the British standard issue bullpup infantry rifle. those rifles were designed by people who had engineering backgrounds, but they had never worked in firearms design before. And that turned into a legendarily crappy, terrible gun, not because the guys who designed them weren't decent engineers and draftsmen, but because they didn't have the experience in firearms specifically. And there are so many little small issues that can become just Achilles heels on firearms for reliability. I don't know exactly what's going on with Hill and Mac, unfortunately. I suspect it is a whole lot of those little problems compounding one upon another. I continue to maintain hope that we will see those guns at some point, but I don't know. Unfortunately, the fact of the matter is, when it comes to firearms manufacturing, you have to have deep pockets to be able to have a really good chance of pulling off a new design. The way that works is you have to design the gun, make some prototypes, get the prototypes working, and then you have to transition from prototypes to serial manufacture. You have to be able to, like, making a prototype, relatively speaking, is easy because every prototype is hand fitted. So you make the parts, if they don't fit, you file a little bit here, file a little bit there, get it to work. Prototypes often run really well. In fact, we see that with the L85s. The very early prototype guns run great. It's like the farther they got along in the design process, the worse the guns got. Well, the step after you get prototypes, the next step you have to do is go to an actual production line. And what that means is you have to set up this whole array of tooling and jigs and machines to produce every part. And you're not allowed to touch those parts before they go into the gun. You have to take a part raw off of every machine, put it together, and make a functioning firearm. And that is a huge engineering challenge. I have just the smallest amount of experience actually in that sort of industry and doing that. And if you don't, I would encourage you to, if you don't want to get into that industry or try and research into it deeply, trust me when I say that that's a huge engineering undertaking. It may not sound like one, but that's where all the minutia and the difficult and unglamorous part of engineering and manufacturing comes in, is making sure that all your tolerances, your clearances, your machine settings, like how many parts can you run with this cutting bit before it's too dull and now it doesn't make parts to the right tolerance anymore. Stacking tolerances, all these things come into play. I'm jumping back and forth here, but this is an example where John Garand was such an effective and brilliant man. Is he designed his firearm, the M1 Garand, but then he also did a ton of work designing the machine tooling to put it onto actual serial production. And because he understood the gun so well, he was in a perfect place as a talented engineer to design the machine tooling to actually produce that gun. And if anything, that machine tooling is just as difficult of a design project as making the gun in the first place. So making that jump from prototypes to serial production is huge. And the way this works normally with a gun that's going to actually be a market success is that this is being done by a major company that has deep enough pockets that it can afford to make, like, it'll set up the tooling and they'll make 100 guns or 200 guns or 1,000 guns as an experiment, basically. Like, make those and see if they actually work, and then use that, test those guns, use what you learn to tweak your production line and get that actually working and producing guns without problems. Where you run into trouble is when you're a small company and you can't afford to just make that many guns without actually selling them. And so what those companies tend to do is they'll make a production line, be like, it seems okay, on paper it ought to work, cross your fingers, start making guns and ship them. And then when those guns inevitably have problems because the production line inevitably has some failure in it somewhere, then all of the guns that have reliability problems are going to get shipped back, and it's that return shipping and repair and shipping back out that is just a cash suck that will bleed a company dry. Too many returns and repairs will just kill a manufacturing company. And that's endemic to a lot of the firearms industry today, simply by the nature of the complexity of the machines that we call firearms that they're making, and this very high standard of reliability that we've set for them. So I guess my point in this is, unfortunately, it's really hard to make a firearm and then actually sell it. And I haven't even gotten to the part of, like, you have to convince people to buy it. Even if you get through all of this process, you have to come out the other end with a gun that is interesting enough at a low enough price point to convince enough people to buy it that you'll actually make a profit, and it'll be worth you producing a large number of these guns. I think a lot of people think about, in fact, here's the way to think about it. Think about how many brand new small-scale startup car companies there are. Now, granted, a car is a substantially more complicated more complicated mechanical thing than a firearm, but that's why there are like 0 startup small-scale car companies. You can't do that on a production basis. The only ones that are out there are making prototypes. Like, the closest thing we have to a startup production car company is Tesla. And Elon Musk, running Tesla, has enormously deep pockets to be able to afford this sort of initial production setup. That's the same situation that gun companies are in. If you want to design your own firearm and put it into production, you're taking on a tremendously difficult task, and it should not be underestimated just how harrowing that process will be. And most of the time, it results in failure. And we can see that. If you watch my videos, you'll see that historically. How many gun companies? I mean, just recently, I just did a video on the Whitney Wolverine. It's exactly what happened there. Those were guys who knew what they were doing. They were talented engineers. They ran a manufacturing company, and they still went into the ground trying to make a gun that was actually fundamentally a good gun. I am about to produce videos on carbines made by Lee and by Armstrong and Taylor during the Civil War, right after the Civil War. You'll see those videos coming up very shortly. Those companies both into the ground. All of us who enjoy firearms are lucky that James Paris Lee was willing to take that experience and still, like, you'll see this, Lee's carbine, it was an ignominious failure, and yet he was willing to go back into the industry and try a second time, and ended up inventing the detachable box magazine, which is a huge part of firearms engineering history. So I can't say it's a surprise to me. It is a disappointment. I'm very sad about it, but I can't say I'm hugely shocked or surprised to see a lot of the companies producing innovative, interesting new products like the Hudson H9 and the HMG Sturmgewehrs. I have a hard time being surprised to see those companies not succeed. It's unfortunate, but it really is how this industry works. So if there is an upshot to this video, the realistic part of me says, if you're thinking about designing a firearm, don't. In fact, if you watch the interview I did with Tony Neofitu, fantastic, extremely humble, brilliant firearms designer in South Africa. When I interviewed him, I brought up this question. I said, okay, if you're going to invent a new firearm, where would you start? And he immediately reacted. He said, oh, don't. Like, sit down until the feeling passes. Whatever you do, don't get into this field. It's a disaster. He's not wrong, unfortunately. From the consumer perspective, if you're the guy looking to buy a new gun, here's my one piece of advice. Never pay for a gun up front. If it's not ready to ship, do not pay for it. And right now, I regret not saying that or not being clearer about that with the HMG Sturmgewehrs. I learned this lesson, like 15 years ago. I paid full price for a semi-automatic reproduction FG42 really quite early in my firearms collecting years. And I lost 100% of my money. That company went out of business. This was before Rick Smith. This has nothing to do with the semi-auto FG42s that are available now. Those are fantastic guns, and you'll notice they do not accept payment up front. There's a fee to get on the waiting list. There's $100 earnest money. That's nothing. On a $5,500 gun, $100 to get on a waiting list. No big deal. That's there to ensure that SMG knows that they have a realistic actual waiting list for their guns. What I paid for was full price for a gun on the promise that when it was done, I would get one. And that was a mistake. And if I have one piece of advice for all of you guys, it is do not make that mistake. And I feel very bad for everyone who did pay for an HMG Sturmgewehr. And I think there is still hope that those guns will come through. I don't know the mechanism. I don't know what's going on at that company. But because we have not seen any bankruptcy issues, I think things are still moving, albeit very slowly there, and I have hope that we will get those guns. But in the future, going forward, I will never recommend that anybody ever pay in advance for a gun that's not actually ready to ship. And to be honest, if a company asks for that payment, it makes me skeptical about them now. The companies that are out there that are doing, there are plenty of companies, not plenty, there are a few companies like SMG, Smith Machine Group. Rick Smith is a fantastic guy. His guns take a while, but he comes through and they're of excellent quality. There are guys like that who are making reproductions, interesting new guns, and they do not charge up front. And I think that's my one big takeaway from all of this. So I hope that that you don't hold it against myself and against Carl over at InRange, that some of the guns that we've been very excited about have turned out to have these problems, with Hudson going bankrupt and HMG kind of AWOL. Unfortunately, I think that really is just the nature of the firearms industry today for small companies. It is an extremely difficult industry. It is one far more difficult than most people getting into it realize. And if you're one of those people who emails me, and there are a number of you, saying, I've developed this new gun, it's awesome, I'm ready to invest my life savings in putting it into production, and I'm gonna sell a bunch or make it, it frightens me whenever I get those emails, because this process usually does not work out well for people. Every once in a while it does, and for a few people it turns out to be just an absolute, phenomenal success. Gaston Glock made a phenomenal success, but for every Gaston Glock, there are 99 more people who have crashed and burned and lost a lot in the process, unfortunately. So I think I've probably rambled on enough about this. I'm going to turn this off. We'll be back tomorrow with more of our regularly scheduled Forgotten Weapons content. Until then, don't pay in advance. Don't get into the gun industry except as a hobby. And if you want to build a new gun and sell it and become rich, beware of what you're getting into. Thanks for watching.